Welcome to qnawire.
In this question, we say that the market for pizza is characterized by a downward sloping demand curve and an upward sloping supply curve. First thing we need to do in part A is draw the competitive market equilibrium. So here's our downward sloping demand curve and our upward sloping supply curve. And I'm just going to extend these lines to the margin here. So we want to label the equilibrium price and quantity. And we know that the equilibrium price is just the intersection of supply and demand here. And it generates the following equilibrium quantity represented here. And I'm just going to call this Q1. And we also want to identify the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. Well, I'm going to put consumer surplus here and producer surplus, that triangle there. So consumer surplus is A, and producer surplus is that whole triangular region X down there. We want to find out if there's any deadweight loss. In this case, of course, there isn't, because this is just a free market equilibrium. So the producers and consumers are allowed to interact as they would naturally want to. So there's no deadweight loss here. So no deadweight loss. In part B, we're saying suppose the government forces each pizzeria to pay a $1 tax on each pizza sold. We want to illustrate the effect of this tax on the pizza market and be sure to label the consumer surplus, producer surplus, government revenue, and deadweight loss. So when I impose this $1 tax, essentially what I'm going to be doing is finding the area on this graph to the left of the equilibrium quantity where I can find a vertical distance of $1 that fits perfectly between the supply and demand curve. So since I've labeled all this in general terms, I can just kind of pick wherever I want. So I'm going to say, suppose that this vertical distance here is $1. That's going to be our government tax. When we impose this tax, consumer surplus is constrained to this upper region here. But we have these other regions here to consider as well. So when we impose the tax, producer surplus is pushed to explicitly being X, whereas before it was XYZ in these new terms. Now it's just X. Consumer surplus used to be ABC, and now it's just A. And there was no deadweight loss before. But in part B, we see that we have these new values for consumer surplus and producer surplus. And in addition to that, we have this triangular region here to the right of the new equilibrium quantity. This region CZ, which forms a triangle, is our deadweight loss due to the imposition of the government tax. And the government revenue is just going to be, will just be the $1 per unit tax times the quantity sold or exchanged, which is just Q2. Then in part C, we're saying if the tax was removed, pizza eaters and sellers would be better off, but the government would lose tax revenue. And they're asking, is there a way that we could voluntarily transfer some of the gains to the government and make everybody better off, including the government? Well, so let's look at it this way. When the government imposes the $1 per unit tax, we're forced to exchange at quantity Q2 rather than Q1. Instead, let's ignore the tax and trade at the original Q1, so exchanging Q1 units, in which case consumer surplus goes back to this entire ABC region, producer surplus goes back to the XYZ region as we had in part A. But now, instead of, we're still going to transfer, so the consumers will transfer B to the government. And producers will transfer Y. in which case the government revenue is unchanged, because before the government revenue was just essentially the sum of region B plus Y. Here we're giving them B plus Y, but the consumers and producers both still get to enjoy C and Z. So consumer surplus in this case is just AC, and producer surplus is just XZ. Deadweight loss, when there's this voluntary exchange to the government, is nothing.